Judges 5 in verse 2, after one of the victories that are typical throughout the book of Judges, Barak and Deborah are said, and I forget if it's with the nation as well, sing a song, and part of it says, "When leaders lead, bless the Lord." And presumably this means Barak had learned a lesson about leadership, because if you go back into the details of that, God had called him, and he had not gone until he was urged by Deborah. And then he was willing to go. Today, when we think about leadership, God is, to use a modern term, the life coach. God is the example and the pattern for leading and for effective leading. Tonight I want to look at a similar subject last week. I want to go back to the same passages I did to begin with, John 10, John 13, and Psalm 23, to look at what we learn about leadership in those passages. And I want tonight to add this layer to it, some things that are common to all leadership, all effective leadership at least. Effective leaders have a goal, and then they think about, well, how am I going to accomplish this goal? And so they make a series of plans, whatever is necessary. Effective leaders effectively communicate the goal to some degree, and the plan as is helpful. An effective leader is both confident and humble, and also an effective leader avoids the roller coaster that goes with leadership and the responses of people to him. Effective leaders recognize that effective leadership is not always popular, and it doesn't always produce the desired results. So in John chapter 10, we find all of these elements. Look in John chapter 10 and verse 10. Jesus presents himself as the Good Shepherd. What's the goal of the Good Shepherd? Look at the end of John chapter 10, or right in the middle. Verse 10, Jesus says, "I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it abundantly." That would be one way that would summarize what the goal of the Good Shepherd was. Also look at verse 16. "Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them I also must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd." One flock, one shepherd, life, and have it abundantly. That was the goal. So how was he going to accomplish that? Well, look at verse 9. "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." Well, to be saved would be one flock, one shepherd, all of the goal, another way to describe the goal he had made. And so what's the plan for getting them there? Well, they're going to come through me. Look at verse 11. "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep." That was a part of the plan to accomplish the goal, wasn't it? That the shepherd would give his life. And for a while, the Bible calls that a mystery. It was something God had only partially revealed. Well, then that mystery was communicated, was more plainly spoken. And in verse 3, the Good Shepherd does that. The sheep hear his voice. He calls his sheep by name and leads them out. He tells them, here's where we go, here's where we're going, here's the way to go. An effective leader communicates the plan and the goal and some of those details. The Good Shepherd is confident in his work, in his role. In verse 9, "I am the door." No apologies for that. In verse 11, "I am the Good Shepherd." He knows his role. In verse 18, "No one takes it from me," my life. I'm going to lay down my life. "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again." That's an expression of confidence in who he was and his role and what he was going to do. And yet even the Good Shepherd is humble. The rest of verse 18, just that last part at the end, "This command I have received from my Father." Well, if you're the Good Shepherd, you don't need anybody to tell you what to do. That's not the kind of confidence. The Good Shepherd, Jesus is willing to say, I've been given a command, and it's from my Father, and I'm willing to submit to him. He's both confident and humble. Is that kind of a leader? We might think that's the kind of leader everybody would want, right? Well, no, in verse 8, there's the thief and the robber. They want what the good shepherd has, but they're not willing to be a good shepherd or to submit to the good shepherd. And so the thief breaks in and steals. In verse 19, and even what Jesus said here didn't appeal to everybody who heard. Therefore there was a division again among the Jews because of these sayings. Many of them said, "He has a demon and is mad. Why do you listen to him?" So effective leadership is not always popular, and it doesn't always guarantee the desired goals. Jesus didn't say these things trying to entice people to accuse him of having a demon, but that was the result, even though it was not what he wanted. So Jesus demonstrates here the principles of effective leading. Look at John 13, this another well-known occasion of the kind of leading that Jesus did. Some have called it servant leadership. Well, what was the goal of Jesus on this occasion? Let's look at the end, and then we'll kind of work back. And so he reveals his goal after he washes their feet. In verses 16 and 17, part of the reason he did this, most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So what was his purpose in what he did? Well, his goal was to teach them this lesson, to be sure they knew the lesson and that they practiced it. That they got the idea and they knew how to work with their hands. So how was he going to get them to understand that and to do it? What was his plan for accomplishing that goal? Well, that's verses 4 and 5, the most well-known part of this. He rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded, the kind of thing that the servants would typically do, not the master. And so that was his plan. And at the beginning he didn't tell them why he was doing it. He was letting them learn as they went along. But in verse 12, this good leadership demonstrates communication. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you?" And then he goes and explains what he's done. It's said often in our society, I'd rather see a sermon than hear a sermon. Well, Jesus presented both. He was confident in what he did. In verses 6 through 10, when Peter said, "Well, no, I don't want you to do this." And then Peter says, "Okay, well, not just my feet, everything." Well, Jesus isn't thrown off track. He's not distracted by Peter's confusion. Jesus is confident in what he's doing and why he's doing it, and that Peter needs it and that Peter needs to understand it. He's confident, but can you be both confident and humble, or do you have to choose one or the other? Jesus is washing their feet, confident and humble. And did everybody just immediately fall into place, fall in line? No, not always popular. Verse 8, again, Peter the one who quick to speak up. Well, Peter immediately thought, "You're greater than I am, so you're not going to wash my feet." So he didn't understand, and sometimes that's the reason people don't like what a leader does. They don't understand it, and they don't give it time to understand it. Peter, just wait. He's going to tell you. Just do what the master says. And what Jesus did here did not produce all of the things that Jesus would have hoped for it to produce. In verse 11, Jesus says, "For he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, 'You are not all clean.'" Would you think that after all that the 12 had seen Jesus do and all they'd heard him say, that if he was willing to humble himself and wash their feet, then surely they would all be convinced to trust him, absolutely believe him, and serve him? Of course, Judas did not. And it was just a few minutes later that Judas was going to go out and betray him. And in some ways, we could say Jesus was troubled by that. Verse 21, he was. Jesus had said these things. He was troubled in spirit and testified and said, Most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. Does Judas's betrayal reflect on Jesus' leadership? Not in the least. So even the most effective leaders cannot strictly be judged by their results. And then look at one other, again, familiar passage, helps us to maybe see these principles. Psalm 23. I won't read the whole psalm, but we'll just go through it here and there and notice that all of these elements are there as well. This is written from the perspective of the sheep of their leader, and that offers some good reflection. If I'm a leader, what would those I lead say about my leadership? Here's what the sheep leave a 5-star review for their shepherd. Here's what they think about the leader. Verse 6, for example, the sheep know the goal of the leader. The shepherd's goal is that the sheep will dwell in my house forever. So that's the shepherd's goal. But what's his plan? How's he going to get the sheep to his house to dwell forever? And that's what the majority of the psalm is. He's going to tell them to lie down. He's going to tell them to go to the pasture or to the still water. He's going to lead them, restore their soul. They're going to walk through a valley, but he's going to walk with them and comfort them, prepare a table, anoint their head, fill their cup, provide goodness, provide mercy. Why is he doing all that? Just because he wants the sheep to have a happy life? No, the plan is that's how you get sheep to his house forever. And how did the sheep know that was the goal and that those were the plans? How did David know that God wanted him to dwell in his house forever? David can't just automatically know that. The shepherd must have communicated that to him and told him. And David believed him. The shepherd is confident in verse 1. The shepherd is the Lord. And so everything that we know about who God is, God has a right to declare himself the God of gods, the King of kings, and the Lord of lords. And yet at the same time, maybe we're not surprised, but maybe if we think a little bit more about it, we are, that the Lord would describe himself as a shepherd. That's not the Fortune 500 today or back then kind of position. So for the Lord to say, I'm a shepherd, is an expression of humility. And so who wouldn't want to follow that shepherd? Certainly most people would follow that shepherd. Well, Isaiah 53, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. Is that a reflection? Because the good shepherd is not always popular and doesn't get the results of his sheep that he desired. Does that show or prove that he's not an effective leader? No, it says something about the sheep, but not about the leader. So think of yourself now. What kind of a leader are you? By that I don't mean quality, but just in what ways do you lead? Maybe you can look in the past or the present, or as we go through the rest of this lesson, think about your future and the leadership that lays ahead of you. We also studied last week different areas where there's leaders. There's government leaders, social, political, business. There's leaders, of course, in the home. There's leaders in the Lord's church. He has that plan. And so a variety of leaders, but in which areas do we typically think about leadership? Usually it's the home and the church, because that's the most common for Christians to be involved in. Doesn't mean you can't be a business owner. Doesn't mean you can't be involved in government and be a Christian. It's just when we think of the majority of Christians, then usually, or the majority of the time, then the home and the church, that's what we typically share most in common. And so I wanted to go back kind of using this outline and think about leadership in the home and leadership among God's people and see how these elements work in these areas just as they did in these passages. Of course, you can spend a whole lesson on leadership in the home and these otherwise, but just trying to do all of that in this lesson to help us to see how they overlap and maybe help to apply them. And so if you're a leader in the home, that would be a husband, that would be a father, that would be a mother. A mother is a leader. Could even at some point as children, the older children provide a degree of leadership in ways. And so in any degree, if you can think about yourself in the past or present or future, think about leadership and how these things would apply. What would you say, again, in the present, it might be easiest, but if in the future or the past, you can think about that too. What would be the goal of someone who is an effective leadership in their home? And that could be summarized maybe in a variety of ways, but maybe the most cross-stitched passage framed and then hung on a wall is Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And there's maybe other passages equally as good, but hard to say it much better than that. That's an adequate goal for anyone who's leading, again, to any degree, in any way, that whatever my leadership is in the home, I'm going to serve the Lord, and whoever is going to follow me, we will serve the Lord. But there's some other passage just that you can think on, dwell on, that would summarize, here is my overarching, everything I do, it falls under this umbrella in my home. An effective leader has given thought to that. I've heard it said that a goal without a plan is a wish. I think that's a pretty good way to say that. I'm not sure who said it first. And so effective leadership in the home, they have a goal, and then they have some plan for how to accomplish that. Certainly the specifics depend upon the situation, the decision. Am I single? Am I married? Have one children, young children, children at all phases of life? That's going to affect in some way maybe some of the specific plans. But let me just start with some general plans, we could say. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. And there's a balance to making plans. If you're too broad in your plans, then nobody knows what to do. And if you're too specific, I don't know anyone that could say that they could write out a list of all the specific things they need to do. You're going to leave someone out. It is really an ongoing process of assessment and reassessment. But here would be some ways we might describe the general plans for our home if we're going to lead in an effective way. Deuteronomy 6, verses 5 through 9. Of course, this is under the law of Moses, but I think we can apply much of what Moses says. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Would that be an effective plan to accomplish the goal of, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord? That's a great start. But then what does that mean? Well, these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. An effective leader has to be willing to practice the plans. It starts with him or her. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house. Here's the plan. And when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. You can't outsource this. These things were written for our learning. I think that's Moses was speaking to a nation. These are some pretty good plans for a home. Look at Ephesians chapter 5. But again, that's kind of general and broad, and so it would be some more specific plans. There'd be a variety of passages we could look at. Here would be one, though, that would cover a lot of things, a lot of the plans and decisions that take place in the home. And so Ephesians 5, verse 25, we could say, well, one of the plans is in my home, we're going to put away lying. We're not going to lie to each other. I don't care if you're a leader or a follower, we're not going to lie. We're going to speak the truth. We're not going to be angry and sin. If there's more than one person, we're going to be frustrated with each other. There's going to be anger, but we're going to be able to have anger, and we're going to keep our mouths in control and our actions in control. We're going to be angry, but we're not going to sin. Verse 29, no corrupt speech is going to come out of our mouth. We're going to learn to control our tongue. Everything that we say is going to have a purpose, that it's going to help. It may not all be all positive and roses, but what we say is going to help who we say it to. Verse 31, we're going to put away these things. Verse 32, we're going to put on these things. So that doesn't cover everything, but that's a little bit more specific than Deuteronomy 6, and it's not one or the other, but you can just see sometimes you've got to be a little more specific and narrow what your plans are. You could get even more specific. Galatians 5, 19 to 25, we're studying on in the adult class on Sunday morning. Here are some things that we are not going to do, and here are some things that we are going to do. We're going to be for these things. We're going to be against these things. And that helps to point, even before the leader says anything, this is in his mind. This is his plan. This is where his direction is and how he's going to get them there. And again, you think of other passages. What would you include in your plans? What are some, again, passages, or just how would you word it? What is the direction? If anyone in your family follows you, that's out of your control. But if they do, here's where they'll go. Well, effective leadership has thought about those things, but then they have to communicate those things. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, no man knows the things of a man save the spirit of the man that's in him. If nobody else knows that those are his goals, nobody else knows those are his plans, his expectations for them, how can they follow him? And so an effective leader has given this thought to it, but then he communicates it to those who follow him. How else can she know? How else can the children know? Someone has to tell them. Turn to Psalm 121. Different personalities are more confident than others, but anybody who is going to lead has to have confidence that they are going to lead. What would give confidence to a leader in the home? Confidence that is not arrogance, that is not self-confidence, that is not self-righteousness. Read with me Psalm 121. What is said here would give confidence to any godly leader. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. So the most intimidating form of leadership in the home, if the leader could say this, if I know the Lord is at my right hand, the Lord is the help, I feel inadequate, I've never done this before, I don't know what I'm going to do. But if the Lord is at my right hand, if the Lord builds the house, then those who build it do not labor in vain. And so even the most inexperienced and the most unconfident person, if he focuses on that the Lord is my helper, well, then he can grow in his confidence to do the work that God has given him to do. Our society shows a lack of confident leaders. And while our society is wrestling with all the transgender mess of adults, think about and pity the children who are growing up. We discussed this in class a few weeks ago. Children who are growing up wrestling with that. Why is that? That they're spending time and they're not sure, which am I? It's because they haven't had anyone lead them. And unconsciously, I think it's safe to say everybody here, your parents led you in the direction that you are a boy or you are a girl without even thinking that's what they were doing. But there was an obvious decisiveness. But there are children in homes that don't even have that kind of a leader who has even that degree of confidence. Why not? Psalm 121. If the leader doesn't have this leader, well then who knows which direction we should go? And if I don't know which direction to go, I can't point my children in that direction. Our nation needs leaders, needs confident leaders, not confidence in themselves, but confidence in the one leading the leader. And at the same time, that implies some humility. Verse 2, because I need help. Well, no, I'm the leader. I don't need any help. Well, an arrogant leader doesn't. But a confident and humble leader does, and is willing to admit, I need help. First, I need it from the Lord. And then I need help from those who are following me. Well, if we had that kind of a leader in our home, in every area of leadership, I mean, everybody would want that. Everybody would be happy to have that kind of a leader, right? No, not everybody's happy with that kind of leadership. And Jesus made it clear that if I'm going to follow Him, then and therefore be this kind of a leader, then no, not everybody will appreciate it and desire it or submit to it. Do not think I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword, for I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Look at 1 Peter 4. Sometimes those who do not appreciate that leadership, they're within the home. Sometimes those who do not appreciate that leadership are those outside of the home. 1 Peter 4, verse 3, we spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it's strange. They think you're strange, that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. Notice this weekend, some friends of mine from college, they had a teenage daughter, and where they lived, it was prom weekend. And so their daughter had dressed up and gone out to eat with their friends and done some other activities. But then when it was the time for the dance, they said, and then our daughter didn't go with them to the dance. Our society wouldn't have a clue of what the problem with that would be, because our society doesn't have a clue of what lewdness and lusts are. But the modern slow dance of a young man and a young woman pressing their body against each other while listening to music, nothing pure and of good report and holy about those things. And so here were parents not ashamed to say, here's our daughter, and she's with her friends, but she wasn't with her friends when they went there. That's weird. That's strange. That's unusual in our society. Not very popular. But these parents apparently weren't concerned about whether this increased the popularity of their daughter or what the other parents would think about them. And is that going to guarantee anything for the rest of their daughter's life? No. But that's the kind of leadership that they provided. Again, the most effective leader in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus, as he looked at his family, as he looked at his people, said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." And there are leaders in the home that look at their family and they respond the same way that Jesus did. Sometimes that's a reflection of their leadership. Sometimes it's not a reflection of their leadership. The most effective leaders in the home can have no guarantee of their desired results. And so if you have children, if you choose to marry, and all of the above in every area of life, don't choose to lead because of what you're sure it's going to provide for you. Choose to lead because God has called you to that. Then let's apply the same thing in thinking about the leadership of this church. to my knowledge, we've never had the kind of leadership described in Scripture of pastors, of elders, that God plans, and presumably because never have had that opportunity yet. But I believe it's important for us to keep that as a goal, that we continue to talk about it, even if we don't think in the next week, month, or year we'll be able to do that. We need to be thinking about, praying about, and keeping that as a goal of ours, so that those who in the future could do that work are thinking about and preparing themselves for that work beginning today. But even in the absence of that, there's work that we have to do to cooperate together to accomplish. And Jesus is the leader of this church, if we are who we say we are. Church of Christ is not just some label to stick on. What it means is church and Jesus Christ is the leader of us. And so what would be the effective leading that he would provide? And then when we can have that kind of leadership among us, what would they provide? Well, it starts with the goal. Turn to Ephesians chapter 4. What are the goals that Jesus would have for this congregation? And then if one day we could have elders, what would be their goals for this congregation? Again, there's different passages that we could look at that would describe that. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 12 says that, speaking of the saints, the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, the edifying of the body of Christ. That's what God intends for the church to do, to accomplish, to edify and to equip one another. And that's described in more detail in verse 16, that Christ is the head, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working, by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. So there's a lot there, but I think the goal we could pull out from that, the growth of the body, the edifying of the body, the equipping of every single joint. That's the goal. Another way to say it, Acts 16 verse 5 describes the churches as being strengthened in the faith. That'd be a good general goal. As a church, we want to be strengthened in the faith. Whoever would lead us, we want them to have the goal of strengthening, of us being strengthened in the faith. So, what are the plans? How is a church edified, equipped, strengthened in the faith? And again, this takes some thought and wisdom, because if the plans are too broad, then nobody knows what to do. If they're too specific, then we may overlook some other things that are essential. So it also requires an ongoing assessment. But we read verse 12 about at least part of the goal, to equip the saints, to edify the saints. Well, what was the plan for that to happen? Well, go back to verse 11. That he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints. So be sure we don't just stop in verse 11. Those workers are among the saints. And so that's his plan. For the saints to do their share, for the apostles and prophets to do their share. And we have the work that they have done. For evangelists to do their share, for pastors and teachers to do their share. That's, in a general way, we could say, the plan of our head, Jesus Christ, to accomplish his goal for this church. Okay, so we want evangelists, pastors, teachers to equip the saints and edify the saints. Well, that's the plan. Okay, so how does that happen? So we need some things more specific. Well, things like Hebrews chapter 10. Well, stir one another up to love and good works. Okay, there's lots of ways we could do that. How do I do that? Well, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves, but exhorting one another. And so much the more that isn't just a repetitive loop, but it grows in intensity and in our desire to accomplish that. There's one way that happens. Okay, well, what else? look at 1 Thessalonians 5. Here are some specifics, and this is where those who lead need some maturity and some wisdom, because sometimes the plan has to be specific to a need. And so here we get that in a lot of work, summarized in a few words. 1 Thessalonians 5, 14 and 15. Now we exhort you, brethren, warn those who are unruly. Comfort the faint-hearted. Uphold the weak. Be patient with all. See that no one renders evil for evil to anyone, but always pursue what is good, both for yourselves and for all. So that's a pretty good plan. It summarizes the weak, the unruly, the faint-hearted, something for everyone. But then that requires some discernment, because I don't want to warn the weak. I don't want to comfort the unruly. So this requires a lot of attention, of individual attention. And so there has to be a plan for that. Well, what happens if we don't have any plan? Or what happens if we have a plan and it's the wrong plan? It doesn't actually get to the goal, even if the goal was the right goal. Well, for some examples in Scripture, read or just review in your mind what you remember from Revelation chapter 2 and 3. I don't know enough of the background of each church to say, but there was either a problem in these churches, the wrong goal, or the wrong plan, or maybe there was effective leadership, but people were not willing to cooperate with that. They had other plans and they had other goals, but something in this was missing when we read Revelation chapters 2 and 3. And so this gives us a living, breathing an example of the importance of plans and goals. I read this recently. This was put on YouTube by a Church of Christ. They said this: we don't want to be defined by what we are against. We want to be known for what we're for. Well, that sounds kind of happy and good and catchy. But then when I stop and think about it, well, why don't you want to be known for what you're against? If I think about Jesus, he was known. We know what he was for, but we know what he was against. And so there's something wrong there. If you ever hear that, and how commonly people might use that phrase, but if you hear that phrase, pay attention, because there's something working behind the scenes. There's something wrong in the goal. There's something wrong in the plan. And maybe better advice is run. Go the opposite direction. Find some other planners and some other leaders. I didn't get to hear the lesson, but I read the title of a lesson titled this: Grace. Don't tell me what it isn't. Again, the question is, well, why not? Paul told us what grace is in the book of Romans, but he also said, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. I think the implication is there's some things that grace doesn't do. So there is a mindset in our society that would say, even sometimes among Christians, yeah, the goal is we want to grow, and the way that we're going to grow is let's be known what we're for, not for what we're against. That's the wrong plan. Let's be balanced. Let's be known for both. What would you include in plans for us or among the congregation where you are? Well, leaders are going to have a goal and they're going to have a plan. In the same passage, how can anybody know the plans that leaders have if they don't communicate them and don't do so effectively? And that also requires some wisdom. If you want to think about that more, there's a lot of things we could think and read about in more detail. But in Acts chapter 6, here among a young congregation and a large congregation, you had the problem of some who were being neglected. And if you read Acts chapter 6, you see a very effective leadership. The apostles are the leaders. It's not everybody gets a vote. It wasn't a democracy. But the apostles there get the participation and get the help of those whom they're leading. A wonderful example of effective leading and effective communication within the congregation. How can we know what we're doing if some of us don't know what we're doing? And then how can we do it together if we don't know? So important. Effective leading in this congregation needs confident leadership. Well, confident in who? In Romans chapter 16, verse 16, Paul writes to the church in Rome and says, "The churches of Christ salute you." For some people, the churches of Christ are the result of an American grassroots movement back in the 1800s. Is that what Paul meant when he said that? No, I'm glad there were Christians in the mid-1800s in America, but what Paul meant by that was that was a very simple way to identify God's people working together under the authority of Jesus Christ. So a point is, who are these leaders confident in? Confident in leaders of the past? Confident in themselves? Well, no. Paul's point was the churches belong to Jesus Christ. Why could there be effective human leaders today? We live in a society where obviously religious leaders are viewed skeptically, and because of false religion in our society, rightfully so. So could someone say, well, I could effectively do the work that is described in the New Testament as a bishop, an overseer, an elder, that kind of a leader? Could I do that? We could, if Christ is the head and we follow His leadership. That's not arrogance to say, I'm willing to do that, or in the absence of having those, for some among us to say, I'm willing to do that one day. That's the kind of humility that is needed. In Revelation chapter 2 and 3, again, elders are not specified in any of these congregations. I don't know what that does or doesn't mean, doesn't prove anything one way or the other, but in some way in the home and among the church there was a failure in leadership at the least among 5 of these 7 churches, because Christ was ready to say to 5 of them, or did say, if you don't repent, then I'll remove your lampstand. You may claim me, but I won't claim you any longer. Humility requires, we see, well, if that could happen to some of the Lord's churches then, could that still happen today? Could that be true of us? Humility is always willing to say, if it is, I want to know. Leaders need confidence and humility, and the way that they lead will not always be popular. We might idealistically think, well, the world wouldn't like that kind of leadership, but among us, then among Christians would always welcome that kind of leadership. And yet, the majority of the passages that we read about of leaders in the New Testament, it includes something about the hindrances and the objections that they're going to face, and that they have to be prepared to deal with that. Titus 1, verse 9, these men are to be holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine to both to exhort and to convict those who contradict. In Romans 16 and verse 17, the same kind of thing is said, but is not addressed to the elders or to the overseers. But in this case, it's referred to the brethren. Paul says, I urge you, brethren, note, identify, mark, know who they are. Those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine, to the teaching which you learned, and avoid them. And so effective leaders are not always popular, and there's no guarantee that effective leaders will accomplish the results that they desire. And again, Revelation chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches illustrates that. Jesus, without question, I think, among us, the most effective leader to have ever stepped foot on this earth. And what's his winning percentage in Revelation chapter 2 and 3? 2 churches out of 7 churches that he sends this message to and expresses confidence in the direction that they're going. The others weren't a failure. They weren't given up yet, but they were moving in that direction. Does that say anything about any kind of lack in the leadership of Jesus? It does not. What about the leadership among them? Just have to consider that on a case-by-case basis. But godly leaders today have to prepare for the same kind of responses that we see to leadership in the New Testament, because there, especially in Christ, we have the pattern and the model of effective leadership. And so God's leadership proves to us that effective leading is not a matter of numbers or visible results, because Jesus said from the beginning, there's many that are going the wrong way, and there are few that will enter into the narrow way. So if I'm willing to be a leader up front, I have to accept that possibility. And so the leader isn't in it for the numbers or for recognition from men. A leader is there to go the way he ought to go to please his God, so that if anyone will follow the leader, they'll end up at the same place. Any parent, any husband, any overseer among God's people, or in any circumstance, if your focus as a leader, if your practice is to please God, then that's an effective leader in the eyes of God. And so in conclusion, two questions. Are you leading? And if not, then when and how? And are you leading effectively? More can be said more effectively than I can say it, but maybe these will help contribute to our growth as a church and in our homes and in every way and in everywhere that we lead. Turn your songbooks to number 230. We have the greatest leader who has done everything that is necessary to bring us to himself. And we sing this song to remind you of that. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit from eternity have had goals and have had plans and have revealed those to us. And if you know tonight that you're lost in sin, then you have a leader, you have a head waiting for you, waiting to see your faith and to hear you confess your own faith, and waiting for you to appeal for the blood of Jesus Christ by your willingness to be baptized into Jesus Christ and into His death. Or if as a Christian you need to return to Him, and by faith, live by faith, pray and ask for forgiveness in faith that He will. And if we can do that with you and encourage you, come forward, tell us how as we stand and sing.